Here it is, the total redesigned M2 Macbook Air. I mean, let me put it this way, holding it in my hand, this is an absolutely stunning laptop. I mean, just look at the chassis, it is that thin. I mean, and also, did you know that it is the same thickness as the first generation iPhone? I mean, that is just absolutely amazing. But what I really want to know is how this laptop, this M2 MacBook Air with passive cooling, is going to perform against the previous generation M1 MacBook Air, and also how does it stand up against, for instance, a 13-inch MacBook Pro with the M2 chip on the inside that has the active cooling. Let's find out together in this real-world photography workflow test. This is ArtIsRight. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. A big thank you to those of you who have already subscribed to the channel. If you're new, welcome. Please consider subscribing, this way I can grow the channel and make more content like this in the future. This is going to be jam-packed with a lot of information and a lot of charts. If you want to analyze the result yourself, feel free to pause the video. This way you can compare this machine performance against all the other machines that I have in the lineup. This said, let's have a look at our test system. This is the base M2 MacBook Air. 8 CPU, 8 GPU, 8 GB of memory, and 256 GB of SSD. If you are a pro and you're using this in a pro environment, this is definitely not the configuration that I recommend. But we're going to see how this machine performs, specifically against the M2 13-inch MacBook Pro. And for those, I have two different configurations, one with 8 GB of memory and another one with 16 GB of memory. Aside from that, there are a few differences between the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro, being that the number of GPU cores on the system are going to be different, particularly based on the base MacBook Air configuration that I have selected. You can definitely go in and upgrade this to, for instance, a 10-core GPU so that you can bring the number on par with the 13-inch MacBook Pro. So that is definitely something that you can do. Another thing about these MacBook Air that you have to realize is that they have passive cooling, meaning that there's no fan on the inside. It is really silent, but that means that when the chip gets hot, well, it has to throttle down the performance. And in the 13-inch MacBook Pro, it is an active cooling system, meaning that there is a fan on the inside. So when the machine gets hot, well, the fan can just pretty much ramp up and cool the chip down. So we're going to see how much of a difference these two are going to make between active and passive cooling. In addition to this, I'll be comparing this particular base M2 MacBook Air with all the other M1 in the lineup too, from the M1 Ultra, M1 Max, M1 Pro, including the Mac Mini M1 and also the MacBook Air M1. Particularly, what we're going to do is definitely compare the M1 MacBook Air and the M2 MacBook Air to see how they perform against each other. This is definitely going to be very interesting. For this, I am not including any result from the Intel machine, and the reason why is because we're already very deep into the Apple Silicon cycle. If you want to see the way how an Intel machine would perform, I will leave a link to my latest video, the Ultimate M1 Ultra comparison, up here and also in the description below. That's really going to include results from two Intel machines, the Mac Pro and the 16-inch 2019 MacBook Pro, so that you can see the result, how they compare against the M1. In short, if you're coming from an Intel machine, any M chip that you pick is going to bring much better efficiency, much better battery life. And if you go with any of the Pro or higher, you're definitely going to get a much better performance compared to the Intel chip as well. Everything has been retested in these videos. That's because there are a lot of changes in the OS and the app. And I also learned a few things too that I find very interesting, so I'll be sharing them with you. So my impression of this MacBook Air is that it is a really awesome machine. I mean, one of the things I can show you right now is that I have the first generation 2G iPhone. If I close this down and set this side by side, it is pretty much the same thickness, the same profile. Well, considering that if you don't think about the feet of the machine. So that is just really awesome. Now, beyond just this really cool design for this machine, what else is there? Well, obviously the same thing that I have mentioned in my other videos, the lack of optimized app is still there. We have native apps now, and the apps are just getting optimized for M1 at this point. I mean, the M2 are not really optimized yet. It's super new, so give the developers a little bit of time before they can optimize these apps. But once they get these apps optimized to run on the M2, I think that we're going to see a performance improvement. Now, as far as are we going to see leaps and bounds of performance improvement, I wouldn't say so. I would say that we'll probably see anywhere between 10 to maybe 40%, depending on the app they're using and what components or what resources of the system that app is actually targeting in the optimization. This will focus on pro photography workflow and pro photography apps. So if you are a casual user, you can definitely watch this video to get some more information about the way how the machine performs. But what I want to know is, as a pro photographer, how would these chips perform if you're just really going on a budget machine, if you're starting out, if you don't want to invest in a full 16-inch MacBook Pro just yet, but you just want something to start you out in a career, or if you're switching from a PC, for instance, to see how these machines would perform. Because, I mean, let me put it this way, these are really great Macs to, be your first Mac to get into, but it may not necessarily be the Mac that can sustain you in the long run, meaning that you may want to get a more pro machine later on. Now let's talk about design. Obviously, this is a total redesigned MacBook Air, and I really love the way how it feels in the hand. The design language follows very closely the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro. Keyboard is pretty much the same, the way how the screen is designed. It's very identical to each other. I really love what they have done, and also MagSafe 3 has made its way back into the machine, so that's really awesome. You can charge the machine and also connect two peripherals at the same time, because now you have a little bit more ports. In fact, this MacBook Air M2 has more ports in comparison to a 13-inch MacBook Pro M2. So just something to think about there for a second. There's one extra port because you no longer have to share the power with a USB. You can just charge via the MagSafe, which is really awesome. As I mentioned before, the MacBook Air has passive cooling, so we're going to see the way how this performs. But I can tell you one thing, that in my testing, I spent literally the whole day just pretty much running tests on this machine to get this result out as fast as possible, is that the chassis, including the palm rest, gets extremely hot during, all these testing run that I am doing. This is something a little bit different than the 13-inch MacBook Pro, the M2 one, where, the palm rest gets kind of warm, maybe slightly hot, but it's not quite as hot as the MacBook Air. Now, these M2 have a media engine built in, but it doesn't really mean much, as you're going to see, because I'm also including the result from Final Cut Pro in these tests too. And these display inside the new MacBook Air M2 does not have any type of reference mode like the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro or the Apple Studio display or the XDR display. So these are pretty much what Apple would consider consumer display. The way how you would go in and calibrate these would be the same way that you would go in and calibrate previous Mac, and I'll also leave links to those in the description below this video too. Display connection and calibration issue. Based on my testing so far, I haven't found anything that really jumps out. We're able to get the refresh rate, we're able to go in and calibrate, there's no problem whatsoever, so everything is good so far. ArtIsRight Calibrate software has been functioning, and I've calibrated this display, so we are good on that point. As far as calibrating BenQ SW display, I ran some tests on this one. It works just fine. I recommend using the latest version 1.3.17, and you should be okay calibrating any SW display that you want to link up to the system. Now, this being said, we need to talk about the M1, just the regular M1, and also the M2 limitation. Granted, M2 can support one external display up to 6K, however, that's only one display. And if you need to link more to it, well, the chip has a cap of 2 display total. Because these are laptop and they already have one display built into it, whether the display is on or off or in clamshell mode, you can only link up one external display to the system, and that's pretty much just the hard max that these chips can handle, these native display. There's always display link that you can use. However, if you're running any type of graphic intensive application, if you're doing photo editing and all those things, I don't recommend using display link because there are going to be performance degradation and color. Well, on a software calibration, it will work, but on hardware calibration, it would not work with display link whatsoever. I've also ran a test on this laptop with my BenQ EX3210U. That is a 4K display, 32-inch, that can run at 144 Hz. Using a USB-C to DisplayPort connection, I'm able to get that full refresh rate, and I can also select variable refresh rate, so that's not a problem, and that's a good thing to have here. So the main question is, should you get one? Well, it ultimately depends on where you're coming from and the machine that you currently have, if you're upgrading, for instance. And all these answers are going to be extremely relative. So I like to show you a result first, and I'll give you some of my thoughts about where these machines land. And if you're a pro, there may be better options out there in the current Apple lineup right now that you should consider. A few other things I want to share with you is that inside these machines, there are non-upgradable components, meaning that the SSD, the RAM, you can't upgrade them once you have configured a machine. So if you think you're going to need more in the future, I would definitely consider your future needs. But just remember though that we like to think that we're getting a little bit more of this or a little bit more of that and is going to be future proofing something, and it's really not, because at some point these machines are going to, you know, be obsolete. So that's one thing to keep in mind. I wouldn't say that you're trying to future-proof the machine, but I'm trying to say that what you're doing is considering your future needs more so than anything else. And with this in mind, let's have a look at the SSD speed and size. Let me simply put it this way. I have a video upcoming that will show you a comparison between a 256 and a 512 gigabyte SSD inside the M2 MacBook Pro, and it will demonstrate that for majority of the tasks that we're going to be doing on a real-world basis in a photography workflow, the SSD speed almost makes no difference whatsoever. There's only a very few tasks that may show a slight difference in performance, but for the most part, you're not going to see that much of a performance gain or degradation. Now, when we're talking about these M2 and the fact that they're not performing really well, it's really coming from the lack of optimized app. Make sure you subscribe to the channel for that, so when I release a video, you can actually learn from that video and a lot of my analysis that I have been doing in the back end. Let's have a look at the 256 gigabyte SSD speed inside the M2 MacBook Air, the M2 MacBook Pro, and also the MacBook Air M1. You can see that the M1 speed is over 2 gigabytes per second, and because Apple has included two 128 NAND chip on those computers and linked them in a RAID 0. That's why they are much faster. When it comes to these machines, Apple have already done the calculation, and they already know what I have already seen in my test result, that for majority of the things that the users for these machines are going to do, they're not going to see any difference whatsoever. So let me put it this way. SSD speed gate is a non-story. So don't even worry about the speed. Configure the SSD based on the size that you need. This being said though, on a 512 gigabyte, I actually got another machine to run these tests specifically, and on the M2 MacBook Pro, well, the speed is pretty much over 2 gigabytes per second, as we are expecting, because they have two 256 gigabyte NAND together running in RAID 0. Let's have a look at the result from Lightroom Classic. Everything have been retested using version 11.4.1 running on macOS 12.4. And as a quick background, Adobe have gone in and enabled graphic acceleration for exporting, starting with version 11.4 and also 11.4.1. So we're supposed to really see a huge performance jump, which we're seeing on many of the Macs. However, on these M1 and M2 chip with 8 gigabytes of memory, we're not really seeing that performance jump whatsoever. In fact, the GPU is not even being utilized upon exporting. So this really caused me to really do a lot more digging and a lot more figuring out. And I finally figure out the fact that on an 8 gigabyte machine, Adobe does not go in and enable graphic acceleration on exporting by default, whether it is an M1 or M2 chip. If you have a machine with 16 gigabytes of memory or more, you're okay. But if you're running on these 8 gigabyte machine, you have to go in and enable them yourself. And I think on certain Intel machines, you have to also go in and enable this yourself too. So this tip will work for multiple different machines. So to enable this, what I'm going to do is jump onto my M2 MacBook Air and show you Lightroom Classic. What you would simply do is go into Lightroom Classic menu, Preferences, or Command Comma. On the tab at the very top, what you want to do is click on the Performance tab. Right now, Camera Raw Use Graphic Processor, you can see in the first box at the very top there, is set to Auto. Auto for this M2 Apple chip, meaning that your system automatically supports limited acceleration. On other computers, for instance, the one that has 16 gigabytes of memory or more, it says it supports full graphic acceleration. So to enable this, what you simply have to do is click on that drop-down list, choose Custom, and go in and put the check marks in every single box that you can see. Use GPU for display? Yes. Use GPU for image processing? Yes. And also use GPU for export. Once you do this, you will see the export time significantly reduced and also the GPU on the system being utilized for image export. I'll have a chart to show you this comparison too, as far as the time difference between the two. Now let's jump right back in and look at the preview result in Lightroom Classic. Comparing the M1 and the M2 MacBook Air, we can see clearly that the M2 is slightly faster. This is a good thing. It's about 2 minutes. Remember though that the M2 is not fully optimized for Lightroom Classic yet. So once Adobe have gone in and optimized this, I think we're going to see a slight improvement beyond what we're seeing right now. Comparing this to the other machine in the lineup, well, we're starting to see a difference between the MacBook Air performance versus, for instance, the 13-inch MacBook Pro M2. And that is the fact that the passive and active cooling system is working very differently. Active cooling system, passive cooling system. So this being said though, the M2 machines are still faster than the, for instance, M1 Mac Mini right now, which is a good thing to see, and this is definitely a move in the right direction. Here's the result comparing it to the other machines. We can see that the M1 Ultra sits at the very top, and the distribution for this is exactly what we expected. M1 Pro and M1 Max sits right behind the Ultra, M2 pretty much right above the M1, and all the other M1s, with the exception of the M2 MacBook Air. Because of the passive cooling, it actually takes a little bit longer. For the export result, this is the one that I mentioned, enabling GPU and not enabling GPU in the 8GB model really makes a huge difference. So with the graphic enable, we're actually cutting the time down to about 40 minutes with about a minute apart from each other. With CPU only, we're talking about export time that are over an hour. So definitely go in and enable GPU acceleration on exporting on an 8GB machine, because that's definitely going to help out a lot with regarding to the export time. Comparing this with the rest of the lineup, amazingly enough, the Mac Mini M1 with 16GB of memory still sits at the very top, and follow closely by the M2 with 16GB. And as we start to see, the less memory the machine has, going from 16 to 8GB, we're starting to see a time increase, not to mention that we're going from active cooling, the one with the fan, to passive cooling in these last two machines. Taking a look at this export comparison chart, there's a lot of information we can gather from it. Starting with the M1 Ultra that sits at the very top, what's interesting to me is the two M1 Max that are pretty much around 3 minutes apart on the export time. And when we look at it a little bit closer, we can see that there are memory differences between these two systems. In fact, if you look at the memory column, you can clearly see that the less memory you give the system and the program, the longer it takes to export your files. Interestingly enough, the 16GB model cluster really close to each other, with the M1 Mac Mini performing pretty much the most impressive in this chart, because it is within a hair of the 16-inch MacBook Pro, and is also beating out the M2 13-inch MacBook Pro that has 2 more GPU core and is supposed to be faster GPU core compared to the M1 as well. This being said, once we lower down to 8GB memory, time starts to increase, and then when we get to the passive cooling, time just really bumps up by quite a bit. Remember though, if you have Lightroom Classic running on a machine that has 8GB of memory or less, go in there and enable graphic acceleration. This way you can get a faster export time. Now let's have a look at Lightroom Classic HDR Merge. Comparing M1 and M2, we're talking about a 3 seconds difference variation. It's not that big of a difference at all. And when we compare this to the active cooling on the M2 machines, I mean, we're not seeing that big of a variation in timing. When we add in all the other chips into the lineup, pretty much the timing are within a range of each other. So let me put it this way. If you're just working with a lot of HDR merge, these machines will work just fine. It's just that when you start to combine a lot of them together, doing multiple HDR merge, you may want to again think about getting a machine with active cooling, because these few seconds, they may not seem like much for just a few individual files, but when you start to add them up, well, a few seconds start to become minutes and hours rather quickly. Now let's have a look at Lightroom Classic Panorama Merge 314 megapixel. Comparing these two machines, they're pretty much within a hair of each other, only around, I would say, like 19 seconds apart. Not that big of an improvement, not as impressive as I thought it was going to be. It is kind of where we expected it would land. This is a task that uses a lot of RAM in the system, so you can see clearly that on a machine with active cooling and also 16GB of RAM, we're cutting down time by quite a bit. So if you do any type of large file or any work with large file doing panorama merge, definitely go in and upgrade the RAM in the system, because that will give you a lot of benefits. Here it is comparing with the rest of the lineup, going up to 64GB. You can see it at the time get cut in half every time you double the amount of memory. So these are just things to really think about when you're working or when you're choosing the machine that will best fit with your workflow. Now let's have a look at Lightroom. This is retested on version 5.4 running on macOS 12.4. The result for the export you can see right now, the M1 MacBook Air apparently is faster than the M2 MacBook Air at this point in time, and I did verify this result multiple times, and yes. So apparently right now, Lightroom is using the old export algorithm, unlike Lightroom Classic that uses GPU acceleration. Based on that alone, we're seeing that a lack of optimized program and also something that doesn't use a GPU acceleration, it's not doing that good of a job on exporting at this point. So again, waiting for optimization. Here it is comparing to the M2, especially the one with active cooling. You can see that active cooling comes out right at the very top, and the other two machines just pretty much trails behind. Here it is with the rest of the lineup, and the distribution is as what we would expect it to be from all these lineup. Now let's have a look at Capture One, because I think this is going to be very interesting. These are all retested with Capture One version 15.3 running on macOS 12.4. On the import time, the M2 is definitely doing a little bit of a faster timing by close to, I would say, like 2.5 minutes, 3 minutes or so. This is good to see, but again, we're not really seeing the leap in performance that we would expect. Granted though, Capture One is not necessarily the program to really be evaluating computers for performance anyway, because it doesn't really go in and target the CPU quite as much as it is supposed to, even though there are a lot of CPU resource available to the system, especially rendering these preview on import. Here it is comparing to the active machine. You can see that there are time variations, but I wouldn't say that it is a huge time variation. It's only like about a minute or two. We start to see a bigger gap in time variations once we start to add in more of the M1 Ultra, M1 Pro, M1 Max, but this distribution list is not really quite what I would like to see. I mentioned this in my previous video that this having 20 CPU cores, we're supposed to see that chart get cut in half, but we're not seeing that. So this is telling us that Capture One, again, not fully optimized for the system quite as well either. What about export in Capture One 22? Well, the export time really shows the GPU utilization and also the GPU difference in speed. So with the M2, 8 GPU and also faster GPU, well, Capture One can go in and really utilize that, and now we have a faster export time. But how does the timing here compare to a machine with active cooling on the M2? So let's take a look. So we can see that the M2 13-inch is pretty much sitting there at the very top. And in fact, the M2 MacBook Air, very impressively enough, is beating out the M1 Mac Mini with active cooling. This is something that I would have expected to see throughout, but is not necessarily something that we're seeing consistently throughout all the programs as yet. So choose carefully the configuration based on the program that you're using. Here's the distribution comparing it to the rest of the chip with different GPU lineup. We can see that going for 48 GPU in Capture One makes no difference whatsoever. And as I mentioned before, if you're using Capture One a lot, maybe you want to consider getting a machine with 24 GPU because it will land just about like right there. It's pretty much going to be within a hair of the 32 GPU M1 Max, but you're going to save like a few $100 there, and also you're going to run a chip that's also cooler as well. Now let's have a look at Photoshop result. I'm using Lloyd Chamber Digital Lloyd test. I will put a link to his website in the description below. I'm running on 3 different tests, and let's take a look at the Photoshop speed comparing the M1 and M2 MacBook Air. Timing between each other, I mean, we can see that when we bump the RAM up to 90%, single core performance, these are pretty much just single core tasks. It's slightly faster by maybe about a second or so. It's not really that big of a difference, but it just kind of shows us and gives us an idea as to how the machine performs. And this is the result comparing this with the rest of the M2. And lastly, comparing this with all the Apple M1 chip that I have tested. Next, let's take a look at Photoshop Medium 15.7 gigabytes. We start to see a few interesting variations. Number one is that with 70% RAM right now, the M1 is beating the M2 out by a little bit. However, when we increase the RAM, this is pretty much beating out by a few seconds as well. I would say this is pretty much a tie in general, that you're not going to see that huge of an improvement, especially if you're working in Photoshop. Probably the best thing that you can do working with Photoshop and working with large files is getting a system with more memory rather than choosing between, for instance, the M1 and the M2. This is the result comparing the M1 and also the M2 in the lineup, and lastly comparing with all the other M1 chips so you can kind of see the comparison. If you take a look at the amount of memory in that chart, you can see that the more memory we give this system, the faster Photoshop is able to run, especially when working with large files. And here's the result for Photoshop Huge, which definitely goes into a lot of swap on the system. And you can see that even though the speed for the SSD in the M1 MacBook Air is faster than the M2, we're seeing the M2 overall performance still much faster by a little bit over a minute right now. So this is telling us, number one, that the SSD speed doesn't really matter so much for swap, because even though Photoshop may go in and utilize swap on the system, it doesn't really read or write at a gigabyte per second. It doesn't even come close to that speed. Secondly, this also shows us that even though both of these machines have 8 gigabytes of memory, the interchange for the M2 at 100 gigabytes per second between CPU, GPU, and all the things that I need to do to compute is really making that big of a difference when it comes to working with large files right now. Here it is, comparing it with the rest of the lineup. We can see a few things. Number one is that the Mac Mini M1, I mean, that machine is still beating out everything else, but it also has 16 gigabytes of memory. Interestingly enough, with 90% RAM, the M2 with 16 gigabytes of memory is trailing behind the M2 Air a little bit. So obviously, when I run through this test again, I'll publish new results if any anomaly does show up, but I did run this test like around 10 times or so. So it's very interesting that the results coming out this way. All right, that being said, here's the result comparing it to the rest. So you can pause this to see the result. And lastly, we're going to talk about Final Cut Pro. We're almost done here, the final stretch. So number one, the encoder engine, the media encoder engine in this chip doesn't make any difference at all in H.264. We're talking about 7 seconds difference. This is margin of error. Comparing this with all the M1 and M2 lineup, the timing is pretty much all about the same. Margin of error, only a few seconds apart. And when we compare this to all the other M1 chip, the M1 Pro, M1 Max, and Ultra, we start to see the distribution coming up a little bit. Again, the M1 Ultra is not even utilizing the quadruple encoder decoder engine on that chip either on these H.264 export. What about HEVC? Well, we're seeing a slight improvement by like about 12 seconds or so. It's not that big of a deal comparing the time to the rest. Again, margin of error. And as you can see right now, the media encoder and decoder engine doesn't really do that much on the system just yet. So on the M2, this is pretty much what we're going to expect. And I can tell you one thing for sure is that no matter how much optimization Apple have done with Final Cut Pro, we're not going to see these numbers for the media encoder engine improve by much at all, if any. So the nice thing about this that we can see is that the ProRes export has shown some improvement in time compared to the MacBook Air M1. However, when comparing these ProRes export to the M2 machines with active cooling, we can see that the M2 with active cooling and even the M1 with active cooling is doing a much better job comparing to the M2 at the moment. Interestingly enough, these two machines perform very identical each other in terms of time. One have active cooling, one have passive cooling. So obviously there are a few other variables that's coming into play that's helping to reduce the time for the ProRes 422 export. And I think that the memory inside these two systems is also playing a role in addition to pretty much just using the chip itself for processing in addition to the media encoder engine. Here it is comparing with the rest of the machine in the lineup. And lastly, we get to my thoughts and recommendation. So what do I think about all this? I mean, let me put it this way. I think that the M2 MacBook Air is such an amazing machine. It's awesome to hold in the hand. It's super light. I love the design of this. It feels really great in the hand, but there's a few things that I want to give you some food for thought. So if you're using this machine in any pro capacity whatsoever, I'd like for you to think about this. I mentioned this already in my previous video for the 13-inch MacBook Pro that if we start to configure this machine, the price is pretty much within a striking distance of a 14-inch MacBook Pro. When you go in and, for instance, upgrade the memory and upgrade the storage on the system, well, you're pretty much within about $300 difference. So what about this MacBook Air? Well, it's about $100 cheaper, but you're talking about a $400 difference. Granted, you are getting a much lighter machine, but with the 14-inch MacBook Pro, you get a bigger battery. You also get a better display in the system. You also get a more powerful chip. You get active cooling. So there are a few things, I think, working in favor of the 14-inch MacBook Pro compared to the MacBook Air. And this is especially if you're going to use your computer in a pro workflow environment. I think that springing out that extra $400 to go for the Pro is probably going to be a better investment down the road than getting a MacBook Air. Now, if you just casually process photos every now and then, you don't work with a lot of large files, you're not planning to really use this machine to really hit it hard with all these raw files all the time, I think that this MacBook Air may work for your workflow. And I think that this MacBook Air is definitely a much better purchase option than getting, for example, the M2 13-inch MacBook Pro. So with this in mind, I have more tests coming. I have a 24 gigabyte model of the MacBook Air coming, so we're going to see how that performs. And I also have another video on the 24 gigabyte M2 13-inch MacBook Pro coming as well, including another separate video that talks about the SSD performance to really give you a true demonstration for the real-world app that we're using that you're not going to see any differences whatsoever. Anyway, if you have stuck around to the very end, thank you so much. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Give this a like, subscribe, and hit the bell if you're new. And in art we trust.